introducing the first Doom-like game for Sega. Zero tolerance, because there's just way too much reality out there.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Player One Start. Today we are continuing our march through the Sega Genesis game library on the Ultimate Sega Genesis Review. Where we last left off, we were talking about action platform games, having already covered all of the launch games for this system. In this video, I'm going to start playing through some of the shooting games, also known as shoot-em-ups or shmups for short. And until I actually started capturing footage for this video, I actually didn't realize how many of these games I didn't already own. So I actually collected a lot of these, and so for most of these games, this is going to be my first time playing through them. And as you can imagine, this era of video games is when these games started really shining through, when the capabilities of the system matched up to what the original creators wanted to present on screen. So before we start diving into games specifically, let's go ahead and take a look at a montage at some of the most popular games and some of my personal favorites. So wow, there are a lot of games to get through, just like with the action platform games. So I'm not going to be able to cover every single one of the games I featured in that montage, but we are going to get through a lot of them. Let's go ahead and take a look. Gunstar Heroes is a run-and-gun video game developed by Treasure and published by Sega. It was Treasure's debut game, originally released on the Sega Genesis in 1993. The game's premise is centered around a pair of characters, the Gunstars, in their efforts to stop an evil empire from recovering 4 powerful guns. The characters can fire guns and perform a series of acrobatic maneuvers to fight enemies across each stage. There are 4 weapons in the game that can be combined with one another to create different shot types. A side note here is that development of this game began among a team of staff working at Konami in 1991. Following an unwillingness from Konami to embrace the original game ideas, the team quit in 1992 and formed Treasure to see this project through. The team reportedly wanted to develop their game for the Genesis because of the system's powerful Motorola 68000 microprocessor. Upon release, this game was a critical success, being praised for its frantic action and advanced graphics. It also helped establish Treasure's place in the industry and introduced several design conventions which would become characteristic of their later work, such as large bosses and a unique sense of humor. Overall, this game did provide a fun experience, especially if you're a fan of the early 90s Konami shooters. Contra Hardcore is a side-scrolling run-and-gun video game that was released by Konami for the Sega Genesis in North America in 1994. This game is another notable achievement on the platform, as it takes everything that makes the Contra franchise great and cranks it up to 11. Everything about this game seems more charged up and faster paced. And even though I do enjoy this game quite a bit, this is one of the more difficult Contra games I have ever played, and that is saying something for a franchise known for its legendary difficulty. This is yet another game that I've already done a review on, and I will leave a link to that in the description below. Turrican was a late-developed game for the Commodore 64 originally, being released in 1990 for that platform, but the following year it was ported to the Sega Genesis. The gameplay of Turrican is almost Metroid-like, with huge levels and a morph ball function. Unlike many other action games of its time, Turrican did not force the player to complete a linear level. Instead, the player can explore each level and uncover secrets. I have to admit this is my first time playing through this game, so I'm very unfamiliar with it, but from what I've read from other reviews online, this is actually not the best port of this game, and many people recommend Mega Turrican over this title. Unfortunately, I do not own that game, so I can't compare it to this one. All I can say for this title is that it's just okay. Sunset Riders was originally released in arcades in 1991 by Konami. It eventually got a port to the Sega Genesis in 1992 and Super Nintendo the following summer. However, it was the Genesis version of this game that received the most changes. For example, only 2 of the 4 main characters are playable in this game. The controls are identical to the arcade version, aside from the addition of 2 shooting buttons instead of just 1. One button allows the player to walk and shoot at the same time, while the other keeps the player in the same position while shooting. Only 4 of the 8 bosses from the arcade version are featured, and each of the 4 chapters are divided into 2 stages. And as was customary at the time, any dialogue speech that was spoken in the arcade version became text bubbles in the home version. Overall, I found this game to be kind of a neat experience. It definitely plays like one of those early arcade shooters that takes place in the Wild West. So if you're a fan of that genre, this game should offer you sufficient entertainment. So one thing I wasn't really expecting too much of this generation were third-person shooters. But I shouldn't be too surprised, as one of the launch titles for this console was Space Harrier, which is very similar to this game, Burning Force. Where this game differs is that the worlds are divided into 4 areas, and there is no vertical mobility, meaning the player is stuck towards the bottom of the screen. In the first two sections of a world, the player controls the character on an air bike, which can move left and right, as well as braking and accelerating. The air bike can also fire bullets and missiles at the enemies. The third area of each world is a boss area, and the air bike will be transformed into a flying ship which can move in all directions. The fourth area of each world, however, is a bonus stage, and the player has to collect as many spheres as possible, which have numbers on them, for bonus points. While this game was not very well received upon its release, it has actually since gained kind of a cult following, and is actually better revered now, and I found this to be an enjoyable experience. Galaxy Force 2 is another third-person perspective game that I think is very well done, mainly because that this game accomplishes giving the player a third-person kind of 3D perspective without producing a single polygon. That's right, everything you see here moving across the screen are just carefully animated sprites and a visual moving background to give a sense of depth. Another impressive feat is that the Genesis is also not capable of scaling or rotating sprites, at least on the stock hardware. Yet the player's ship seems to bank side to side whenever it moves left and right, and enemy ships seem to zoom towards the player. But other than the visuals, I feel that this game is actually very well done in terms of gameplay as well. I didn't find myself getting bored of it too quickly, and there doesn't seem to be anything quite like it on the platform, again on stock hardware. I would definitely recommend this game to anyone who owns an original Sega Genesis. Afterburner 2 is another arcade-style shooting game that gives a pseudo-3D perspective in a third-person view. I vaguely remember this game being in arcades back in the day, so I can't really compare it to what the arcade experience is like. However, what I can tell you is that this game is definitely a lot better than the Sega Master System version. The graphics run at a much smoother frame rate, making it a lot easier to target and shoot down enemy aircraft. However, if I would have got this game back in the day, I may have been a tad disappointed as the gameplay doesn't really offer much except for playing through as far as you can to earn a high score. I do like this game, however, because it offers that simplistic style of gameplay that was very common in late 80s arcade games, and I do believe that this is one of the more iconic titles from Sega's arcade offerings of that time period. And here we have two games that offer, I think, the biggest unexpected gaming experience on this console, and that is a 3D-style first-person shooter. And the first example I have of this is the game Zero Tolerance. Before we get too much into this game, though, I do want to point out how much I love this opening sequence of the game casting shadows over the main character. But diving into the actual gameplay, you can see how this game was compared to Doom in its advertisements. It looks like the game programmers are actually even using the same programming methods to produce the 3D playfield that the id Software team used to make Doom as well. However, as the Genesis processor was not as strong as PCs of the time, the playfield area on screen is actually greatly reduced. In terms of gameplay though, the game is actually made up of 40 levels spanning 3 separate areas. The object of the game is to kill all of the enemies on a level and then proceed to the exit, which is either a staircase or an elevator leading down to the next level. However, nothing prevents the player from heading straight towards the exit without killing all of the enemies. The player though won't get any passwords until the area is entirely completed. If the player dies, that character will be listed as deceased and becomes unavailable for playing. The player can choose from a total of 5 different characters, and once they are all deceased, the game is over. And if you want to hear something completely mind-blowing, the game actually supported connecting 2 Sega Genesis consoles together via a special link cable to enable multiplayer with each person having their own screen. Now that I know this is possible, I'm going to have to try that sometime. Overall though, I do feel that this game is actually more neat due to the fact that they were able to pull it off on this hardware, and I think more modern gamers who didn't grow up with this system probably wouldn't get it. But if you do want to try to experience a first-person shooter on the Sega Genesis, this is the way to do it.
Ammunition deployed.
here's the other first-person shooter I'm going to feature on here, even though I debated on whether or not I should since it's a homebrew title. I decided to go ahead and feature this title as it shows a fully 3D first-person shooter running with a much larger screen resolution in a much better frame rate. So in theory, this homebrew title should run on stock hardware. And I have to say that it is very impressive that they got this title running at this resolution with these graphics, the sound, and the digitized voices, all at a much higher frame rate than what was actually produced at the time this console was relevant. I mean, it is just very impressive, so I decided to go ahead and show this as kind of like a maximum potential for what a first-person shooter can be on this console. And I guess while we're on the topic of shooters, we're going to have to talk about the Sega Menacer, which was the only officially endorsed light gun accessory from Sega for the Sega Genesis. I've already covered this accessory in its own review video, so I'm just going to sum up by saying that there were only 2 cartridge games ever released that were compatible with this accessory. One of the games is a 6-game compilation cartridge that was basically like a sampler for what the Sega Menacer could do, and the other game was Terminator 2, the arcade game. I did enjoy playing this game with the light gun, however, it is not the only way you can play this game. In fact, it's also able to be played with just a regular controller, using the D-pad to control your crosshairs. In my personal opinion, it is not as fun to play the game this way, but I also don't think it's worth it to collect the Sega Menacer just to play this game. Mainly that's due to the fact that you have to find a Sega Menacer and sensor that works, as well as have a functioning CRT, because even though it has a sensor, it still requires a CRT television to work, and after you've done all that, you may get bored of this game very quickly. So it may not be worth the time and expense that you go through to actually get all this stuff set up for the Light Menacer. It may just be worth it for you to have just a quick nostalgia trip by playing it with the controller. However, this is not the only light gun that came out for the Sega Genesis. There was also the Konami Justifier, which works with the game Lethal Enforcers, which I think is a much better game overall. Again, you can play this game with a control pad instead of the light gun as well, so you don't necessarily have to have the light gun and CRT to play this game. Although again, I feel that does make this game a bit more enjoyable. But overall, both of these games do play like the arcade shooters of the early 90s, so if you're a fan of this genre, I don't think you can go wrong with either one of these games if you want to get them for the Sega Genesis. And now the last style of shooting game that we're going to cover on here are the scrolling shooting games. Airbuster is a horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up arcade game that was developed by Koniko in Japan, originally published by Namco. However, when it made its jump to the United States, it was published by Sharp Image Electronics. In this game, up to 2 players take control of the Blaster Fighter starships in their efforts to destroy a mysterious mechanical fortress orbiting Earth, with plans to take control of the planet. The Blaster Fighters can equip one of several weapons which can change the ship's firepower and abilities, such as diagonal shots, homing missiles, and small drones that follow the player's ship. Overall, this game follows the formula of a horizontally scrolling shooter to a T. The game has a typical soundtrack for an early 90s game that uses the synth sound chip, and the graphics are overall visually appealing and bright, although a little bit cartoony in a certain respect. The gameplay itself is actually pretty solid, and I did find myself enjoying this game and playing through it quite a bit, even though I was only supposed to play it for a little while capturing footage. Raiden Trad, short for Raiden Traditional, is the home port of the arcade game Raiden that was released in arcades in 1990, hitting home consoles including the Sega Genesis in 1991. The game itself is a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up game consisting of about 8 stages of increasing difficulty. In the game, the player must maneuver their fighter while engaging various enemies and avoiding their attacks. After completing the final stage, the player returns to the first stage with the difficulty increased. 2 buttons on the controller are used for firing. However, if you hold down the fire button, it will fire repeatedly, but with a delay between each shot. Thankfully though, there is a rapid fire setting in the options. This will fire 3 shots in a row before a short delay. However, it also leaves one of the firing buttons unchanged so you can fire as normal. You also get a limited amount of bombs, which you can drop at any time as long as you have them. Power-ups are collected from both enemies and by destroying objects found throughout the levels, such as crates. Weapon upgrade power-ups will cycle between two different options. Power-ups that are red will give you bullets, and each time you collect the same red upgrade, it will increase your firepower. However, if you collect a blue upgrade power-up, then you will get lasers, and each time you collect one of those, it will increase the firepower of that weapon as well. There are also two types of sub-weapons, which are missiles and homing. Overall, I do feel this game is a solid port of the arcade game, at least on the Sega Genesis. There were a few times where I found some of the sound effects a bit annoying, but in the end I don't really think that detracted from my gameplay experience. This game does control well, and I did find myself enjoying it a lot as I go through, although it is a bit challenging. So in the launch game section of this video, I covered the first Thunder Force that appeared on the Sega Genesis, and that was Thunder Force 2. In this game, its direct sequel, the free directional overhead stage that was previously featured has been removed, and I think that is probably the biggest improvement in this sequel, as I didn't really care for those stages as much as the side-scrolling stages. Honestly, I have to admit that after collecting and playing these games, these are some of my favorite on the Sega Genesis in this genre. Although one nitpick I have about this game is that if you take a look at some stages like this one with this trippy flame background that goes back and forth, it really makes it hard to see some of the incoming enemy projectiles and can lead to some cheap deaths. So the challenge is definitely there, but it's a challenge that I feel can be easily avoided by not having done some of those effects. On the flip side of it, I think those effects are really cool, and I think that adds a bit to the unique art style they were going for with this game. Again, critics and gamers alike both highly praised this game for its graphics and its gameplay, and I would definitely recommend this as a game if you like this genre for the Sega Genesis. And in terms of Thunder Force 4, they definitely cranked up and upped the ante on almost everything they did in this sequel, and I think it's very well done there as well. But whether or not I'd recommend one over the other, I would say that these two are kind of equally ranked in my mind, with Thunder Force 2 being slightly ranked below both of these. If you get tired of the automatically scrolling shooters that are very prevalent from this time period, then SubTerrania may be a game that you want to try out. This game differs in the fact that it is a multi-directional shooter that gives you free reign to explore the levels. The game takes place in a side-view underground environment, with the controls being similar to the 1982 arcade game Gravatar, which inspired the home game Thrust. The ship is rotated with a directional pad, while a button on the controller applies thrust in the direction the ship is facing. At all times, gravity is pulling the ship's player down, which works to the player's advantage when trying to conserve fuel. To complete each level, the player must complete various mission objectives, which are outlined before the level begins, with the exception of the last 3 levels. The bulk of the missions involve rescuing prisoners, collecting sub-modules to allow your attack ship to go underwater, and defeating alien bosses. The game's strategy comes down to defeating enemies all while trying to conserve fuel so you can make it to the end of the level. You can collect fuel canisters, which will extend the amount of fuel you have in your ship, but there are also other elements in the levels that make it easier for the player to be able to finish without running out of fuel, such as mining rails which are suspended throughout many levels that you can ride on with your ship that turns off fuel consumption, allowing you to freely slide along them while shooting. One interesting note about the development of this game is that the developer did not possess an official Sega development kit. Instead, they hacked together their own development kit by using Amiga computers. This game was well received upon release, and I ended up finding this game enjoyable as well. I definitely appreciated the break in having the side-scrolling action that just automatically happened, to being able to control where my ship goes, and having the extra strategy of not running out of fuel. Although I think that these departures will not appeal to all players who enjoy this type of game, I think this game would actually appeal to a wide variety of players who may or may not already like shoot-'em-up games of this time period. The Steel Empire is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up game released for the Sega Genesis home console in 1992. This game is unique in the fact that its visual design is a little bit different, mostly low-tech in nature at a time when most games were featuring advanced spaceships with laser cannons. This game is set in the late 19th century of an alternate world. The game's aircraft, weaponry, power-ups, environments, enemies, and bosses are all heavily stylized, adding strong steampunk elements to the style, themes, and visuals of the game. Steam power, propeller-based aircraft biplanes, and heavily armored steam trains with giant cannons play large roles in the game's protagonists and opponents. At the time of this game's release, reviews were mixed to positive. However, it has gained more of a cult status many years after its release. Overall, I feel that the draw to this game for me is the unique aesthetic design. The gameplay is solid, but I think that the fact that this game takes place in more of a futuristic past environment makes me more engaged in what's going on. Overall, I found this game to be an enjoyable experience. MUSHA, or Metallic Uniframe Super Hybrid Armor, is a vertically scrolling shooter developed by Compile and released for the Sega Genesis in 1990. The player takes on the role of a pilot who flies a specifically designed mecha vehicle with advanced weaponry called a MUSHA. When this game was released, it received several mixed reviews, partly due to the oversaturation of shoot-'em-ups in the marketplace around the time of this game's release. I will say that the graphics in this game kind of have more of an anime style that I think would be more appreciated by modern audiences playing this game, as it has grown in popularity since the time this game was released. Other than that, while this game doesn't stand out too much from its competition in terms of gameplay, it actually provides a very solid shoot-'em-up gameplay experience, and I would definitely recommend it if you want to play another one of these games on the system. Gaiares is a scrolling shooter developed by Telnet Japan and published by Renovation for the Sega Genesis in Japan and North America in 1990. The title is the word Gaia, meaning Mother Earth, and an abbreviation of the word rescue, Res, which is the main objective of the battle taking place within the storyline. Out of all the shoot-'em-up games that were released for the Sega Genesis, this one reminds me the most of R-Type, which happens to be one of my favorite shoot-'em-ups of all time. But it also happens to be one of the most challenging games ever made as well, and that is definitely true here with Gaiares. However, where this game differs from R-Type and several other side-scrolling shooters is the unique power-up weapon system. Known as the TOZ system device, it can be fired out like R-Type's Force, except each time it comes into contact with an enemy, it will inherit and learn its weapon. The player can steal from the same enemy repeatedly until the weapon's strength is maxed out. There are 18 weapons in total to be captured, and the appearance of each weapon varies depending on the strength meter. Many of the stage's designs were heavily influenced by games like Gradius. Gaiares also makes extensive use of parallax scrolling, with wave and warping effects across all of its stages. However, as I mentioned before, this game is very notorious for its very high difficulty level, and it took me many playthroughs just to get through the first stage. But if you're looking for a side-scrolling shooting game that definitely offers up the challenge, this is the one to beat. So wow, one thing I didn't realize before I started this video was just how many of these games are actually on the platform, and how many of them I personally enjoyed. I will state for the record that this is one of my favorite genre of games from this time period. I grew up on games like R-Type, and that was pretty much the only one I played for a long time, but I really enjoyed playing a lot of these games, even though it was my first time going through them. One thing that I want to note that isn't very prevalent in my gameplay here is that these games are often very difficult. It requires a lot of fast, quick reflexes, and there are some areas that I thought that it led to some cheap deaths because you really couldn't see the projectiles coming at you, or it offered you no reaction time outside of memorizing the pattern. But that said, if you are a fan of this genre, I think that you won't be disappointed by getting a Sega Genesis and tracking down some of these titles. Although in terms of experience of collecting them just recently, I'm going to say that this is among some of the more expensive titles on the console. There are a few of these that reach into outrageous territories where you're paying more than $100 per title. But I feel that the overall average price for these games is higher than some of the other genres out there, maybe with the exception of RPG games. But anyway, I'm going to pose the question to you again. What did I miss? I'm sure there are games out there that I just either haven't heard of or haven't been able to collect in time for this review that I should try out, and I look forward to playing these games a lot more once this video is over. I almost can't say enough about how excited I have been to play these games, go through this game library, and find a lot of quality titles. So for all you Sega fans out there, what did I miss? What should I have included, and what did you agree or disagree with some of the games I did feature on this show? That said, that is going to wrap it up for this video. Remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps out and supports this channel. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and stay tuned because I have more Ultimate Sega Genesis review and other projects coming to you shortly. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you in the next one. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.